I would like to welcome Dr. Josh Kaplan. Dr. Kaplan, who is an associate professor in the Behavioral Neuroscience program down the street at Western Washington University. Throughout his career, he has researched how drugs impact brain cell communication patterns using electrophysiology and neuropharmacology techniques. Dr. Kaplan currently runs a lab that studies the impacts of cannabis on the brain. Talia Frost-Belansky is a senior at WWU studying behavioral neuroscience. Her curiosity about how drugs affect the brain motivated her to study neuroscience and join a research lab studying the neurobiology of addiction. She recognized the need for improved drug education and dedicated her senior project to creating a neuroscience-based drug class for high schoolers. Today, they will be sharing the myths and realities of various forms and potencies of THC. Welcome, Dr. Kaplan and Talia.
Thank you for having us
Thank
today.
you for being here. Yes. So for the first question, there's a common message that cannabis is safer than other drugs. Is that true?
I think it's important that we think about where those studies and that message actually came from. And it was derived from research that was conducted in people who were using cannabis decades ago. And it's important to recognize that those studies really took into account cannabis products and cannabis flower that had much lower THC potency than what's available today. The potency of THC, that is how much THC was found in the plant, ranged from about 1 to 4% back in the 1960s and 1970s. It's far lower than the potency of cannabis products today, which ranges from about 15% in your standard cannabis flower, all the way to much higher potencies in concentrates and dabs and that sort of thing. So when we think about the safety, we have to think about the safety of the products that are currently available today and what people are actually using. And so that is a vastly different product, a vastly different drug than the cannabis of the 60s and 70s. And there are studies that are coming out now that are showing the harmful effects that these high THC products can be having on the brain, as well as the development that persists and leads to behavioral changes and cognitive processes later on in life.
And something I just want to add is I think part of the reason that cannabis is seen as a safer drug in THC is because we're shown the cannabis plant, the cannabis flower itself. And seeing a plant that comes directly from the ground kind of just gives us the idea that it's safer, obviously, because it just grew naturally. But we forget that, you know, every drug pretty much originated from a plant, whether it's an opioid or a psychedelic. it originated from a plant, but then we have altered that compound to be different, and it can change how safe it is.
Okay. And we've heard that cannabis is often used as medicine. So why do higher THC levels lead to health problems?
Yeah, so it's true that THC has been used for medicinal purposes, and I think to really understand how it can become detrimental to our health, we need to understand, well, how is THC able to impact our brain, and how is it able to lead to the sensation of being high, right? So the way it does that is through interacting with a system that already exists in our body called the endocannabinoid system. And that system, there are receptors called CB1 receptors, and that is the place where THC is actually able to interact with our body and our brain specifically. And it's sort of like a magnet, like THC is attracted to the CB1 receptor, and that's how it's able to impact the system that regulates a bunch of things from cognition to mood, anxiety, appetite, sleep, all of these really critical systems. So when THC enters the body, it's going to impact that system. And we see that over time, THC can overstimulate those receptors, and they actually go away. So we have less CB1 receptors after long-term use of THC than we had to begin with. And if you think about all the critical systems that those CB1 receptors are modulating, it can be detrimental.
And that's a great point. And just to add to that, when we're thinking about THC potency, how much THC is in a given product, the more THC there is, the stronger it activates that system, and the faster those CB1 receptors go away, leading to a quicker onset of health problems that can develop.
Okay. And people have traditionally smoked cannabis, but are there safer ways of using cannabis, like edibles?
Yeah, so the narrative that consuming cannabis through some other method other than smoking is safer is not really founded by any actual scientific evidence. The idea that you're not bringing something into the lungs doesn't mean that it's automatically safer. And so if we think about what happens when we smoke or vape cannabis, what happens is that THC gets directly dissolved into the bloodstream, where it circulates throughout the body, enters the brain, and causes its effects. It bypasses the liver, which is an important organ in breaking down drugs and other molecules in our body. When we eat an edible, something like a brownie or cookie that has THC in it, what happens is the liver breaks down that THC and converts it into a product, a metabolite known as 11-hydroxy-THC. I know, a terrible name, and I'm sorry for that, but it's important to recognize that the 11-hydroxy-THC has stronger effects on those CB1 receptors that Talia was talking about than THC alone. So while you don't get as much THC in the body from eating an edible, you get more of that 11-hydroxy-THC. And the consequence of that is it can lead to a lot of negative acute effects of consuming edibles. People report experiencing high levels of anxiety, even acute psychosis after just having an edible that doesn't look like it has that much THC in it, especially when you compare it to some of the other products that are available. But because you get more of that 11-hydroxy-THC, it can have really strong effects and lead to a faster rate of tolerance, like Talia was talking about.
And what are your thoughts on synthetic cannabinoids that mimic THC, like spice or K2, some of which are sold in gas stations and other shops? They're like cannabis, but slightly different. Are these safer to use?
Yeah, so let's think back to those CB1 receptors that we've talked about a few times now. And the way that THC is like a magnet to those CB1 receptors, well, the synthetic forms are actually stronger magnets, up to 100 times stronger in some cases. And so if the synthetic THC can bind better to those receptors, it's going to impact the system more and lead to faster negative effects of making those receptors go away, leading to like anxiety and nausea, and in some cases, if there's a lot of THC, a lot of the synthetic THC, we've seen some fatal overdoses. And so the more potent and the more THC that's found in whatever form of administration, whether that's from smoking weed, the flower itself, or dab wax, or edibles, the more potent it is, the more the faster it's able to impact that system and lead to some of those negative consequences that we've mentioned.
Yeah, and if we think about why or how these drugs become illegal in the first place, it really all it does is take a government agency or some scientists working for the government to test it in a lab, identify that it has abuse potential, and leads to this process of making a drug illegal. But that just means that all it takes is like a medicinal chemist or someone who understands how to modify these molecules, take the THC molecule, change it just a little bit, and now it's a legal drug that can be sold at gas stations or other things. And that just doesn't make it necessarily safer. And just to highlight what Talia said, some of these modifications can make it over 100 times stronger acting on those CB1 receptors, which can have profound negative health effects, both acutely as well as long term.
Wow. And now these next 4 questions are questions that students wrote in. So this first one is, can THC be laced with other drugs?
Yeah, so there are certainly reports that it has been. Anytime you buy something on an unregulated market, you never really know what's in it. And there have been reports of THC being laced with things like cocaine, LSD, and other sometimes harmful drugs. I'll note that that's not entirely common, but you never really know. What is more common is that the unregulated cannabis products are often grown and have a bunch of pesticides in them because that's just part of the cultivation process. They may have molds and other things that when you take that into your body, especially when you heat it up, you take that into your body, it can build up and have really harmful effects, particularly on the developing brain, because these toxins impact the way that the brain develops and will function for the rest of your life.
The next one is, can you OD on THC?
So when we're talking about the synthetic THC compounds like K2 and spice, which we mentioned before are up to 100 times stronger than the THC naturally occurring in the cannabis plant, we have seen some fatal overdoses, and that's because it can impact your heart rate, and people who have a predisposition to cardiac arrhythmias are at a heightened risk for that. But fatal overdoses from THC are pretty rare, especially when you're talking about the smokable, like dab forms. However, there are other forms of overdosing, and that is things like vomiting, acute psychosis, increased anxiety. So those negative effects are indications that there's too much THC in the system, and it can be very riskful and not safe, even if it's not lethal.
Yeah, and there didn't used to be reports of THC overdoses, and I think maybe that narrative has gotten out into the public, and they believe you can't overdose on THC. But again, going back to your first question, THC potencies are rapidly on the rise, and these concentrates and other synthetics are leading to a lot more reports. And it seems like now on a weekly basis we're hearing about case reports of overdoses from cannabis products, and that's just a reflection of the higher THC potencies that are available today.
And what are the long-term effects of THC on your brain?
Yeah, so thinking about those CB1 receptors again, we've already talked about how long-term use of THC leads to a decrease in the number of receptors. And that's powerful because those receptors are regulating really critical systems in your body, like your mood and anxiety levels, sleep, and even memory. So when those receptors go away, the natural molecules in your body that use those receptors to regulate those systems are no longer able to access that system as well, and no longer are able to keep your body balanced in the way that it usually does. So that leads to, over time, tolerance as one effect, because if you have less receptors, then THC isn't going to be as effective at giving that high. And it also leads to a change in a bunch of systems, and potentially dependence also, which is something that a lot of people don't think can happen from THC, but it can lead to dependence.
Yeah. You look at some of the scientific literature around this where they actually use brain imaging techniques to study how regular use of cannabis products affects the brain and what it looks like and how it functions. Some of those earlier studies didn't show really large effects, and so there was this idea that maybe long-term use could be safe. But now what they're finding is, again, coming back to this idea of the high THC potencies that are available and common today, they're leading to profound effects, and they're occurring a lot quicker. So the long-term effects are becoming much more condensed than they ever used to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for the last question, is there a connection between THC and psychosis?
There certainly is. Actually, it's been a pretty strong association that we've known about now for decades. And the justification for this, the reason why people believe that this exists, is because when they've looked at people who have gone on to develop persistent psychosis or schizophrenia, it seems to be associated with early onset use of cannabis products. And the reason for that is still not entirely all that well known. Schizophrenia and psychosis is not necessarily just caused by one thing. It seems to be a combination of things like genetic predisposition, so what your DNA makeup is, in combination with some environmental factor, for instance, drug use. So when the two of those come together, it can have really profound effects. And what people believe is that this genetic predisposition kind of tips the brain's balance. If we think about the brain being in an excitatory, inhibitory balance all the time, maybe it leads to a more vulnerable state. So when there is that environmental influence, in this case, cannabis, it tips that balance in a way that can lead to harmful effects for that individual.
Yeah, and as these compounds, like we've mentioned, are increasing in potency very rapidly, sometimes the product that we have access to has an increased potency well before we actually know what the effects of that are. And I think we're seeing that right now.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Kaplan and Talia, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. Your research has helped us learn more about the health risks associated with THC. On your screens, you will see a QR code that you can access to send any questions that you may have about this presentation. We will work with Dr. Kaplan and Talia to get those questions answered in the coming weeks. Stay tuned for next Thursday's presentation on nicotine salts and vaping. Thank you.